In this video, you will see the game of the century played by 13-year-old Robert James Fischer, the 11th world chess champion. This game was played against the strongest chess player in the USA at the time, and multiple-time US champion Donald Byrne in distant 1956 in New York. It was right after this game that the public realized this 13-year-old kid would, in the future, crush everyone and everything. Byrne plays the white pieces, Fischer the black pieces. So Donald Byrne starts the game with knight f3. Knight f6, Robert Fischer answers symmetrically. White replies with c4 and g6. Black prepares the fianchetto of his dark-squared bishop. White develops his second knight to c3, bishop g7, and d4. White fully occupies the center. Black, for now, castles, not advancing in the center yet. Bishop f4, Byrne develops the last light piece of his queen side while he still delays the king side development. He plays in the center. Black, in this position, of course, already answers with d5. In the center, the most principled, the Grunfeld defense, and Byrne plays hyperactively, bringing his queen to b3. Not the best move, but Donald Byrne, counting on his superiority, allows himself to play like this. Fischer captures on c4, and after the recapture with the queen, his pawn on c7 starts to hang. He plays c6, restricting the white knight in the center on c3. White, taking the opportunity, continues his central activity with e4, seizing space. The black knight moves to d7, with the further route to b6 to disturb the white queen. White continues his energetic play, bringing the rook to the center. The black knight arrives on b6, attacking the queen, and the queen is forced to retreat. But he goes to c5, not allowing Fischer to breathe even a gram. And bishop g4. Fischer develops his last light piece to g4 and eyes the knight on f3. And after this move, Donald Byrne starts to overstep the mark. He places his bishop on g5. For the second time in the opening, he moves the same piece, and his king still hasn't castled. The bishop is still on f1. The genius of Bobby Fischer awakens, and he finds the strongest tactic in this position, knight a4, sacrificing his knight on a4 almost for nothing. White, after calculating the variations, starts to understand that sitting across from them is a true chess monster. The whole point is that taking this knight is completely impossible. For example, the following variation could have occurred after capturing the knight. Black takes on e4 with the knight attacking the queen and aiming at the bishop on g5. Whichever continuation White chooses, he will end up in a lost position. As an example, I will show one of the lines. White could take the pawn on e7, and after the exchange with the bishop on f3, the capture on d8, multiple exchanges of pieces follow. The rook captures on d8, the bishop captures on d8, the bishop captures on d1. The white knight and bishop are under attack. He could return his knight to c3, protecting it with the pawn, and at the same time attacking the bishop on d1 and the black knight on e4. But then comes the rook capture on d8. After the capture with the knight on d1, the rook takes on d4. The following position arises, where Robert Fischer would have one extra pawn and complete domination on the board. The white king would still be uncastled, the bishop still standing on f1, the knight stuck on d1. The rook would, on the next move, enter along the d-file and eat all the pawns it sees. Also, the magnificent bishop from g7 shoots across all the dark squares in the center. This is not even the worst line that could await White after capturing the sacrificed black knight on a4. Therefore, White does not take this knight, but instead finds the strongest continuation. He simply retreats his queen to a3. Now he can capture this knight with the queen, so that the white knight also controls the pawn on e4. But now comes the capture on c3 with the knight. An exchange follows, White recaptures with the pawn, and the knight still takes the pawn on e4. The black knight becomes active, but the pawn on e7 is left hanging, which White immediately takes advantage of. He captures with the bishop on e7. It seems that black in this position is losing his rook on f8, the exchange, since both his queen and rook are under attack. The queen must be saved, and Fischer places it on b6. Donald Byrne, thinking again in this position, decides not to take the free exchange, the rook on f8. The whole point is that if he were to take it, black would respond with bishop takes on f8, and after the queen retreats, for example, to b3, wanting of course to exchange queens, since in that case he would have the extra exchange, black would play knight takes on c3. Again, the knight is sacrificed, but it is naturally impossible to take it with the queen. Then would follow a pin with the bishop on b4 to the king on d1. But if he does not capture this knight, for example after queen takes b6, the black rook would open up and enter either along the a-file or also along the e-file. The white king is still uncastled, the knight looms menacingly over the position. White would simply not survive in this position. The activity of the black pieces would be too overwhelming. So White also rejected the capture of the rook on f8 in this variation. He finally develops his light-squared bishop and prepares, on the next move, to castle his king. If only Fischer had allowed this. He takes on c3 with the knight, once again sacrificing the piece on c3. Capturing this knight is still unfavorable. Then black would bring his rook to e8, pinning the white bishop on e7 to the king and winning it later. The white position would still be lost. White finds the only strongest move. The bishop goes to c5, attacking the queen and also making it possible to take the knight on c3, and now the bishop on e7 will no longer be hanging for white. However, black first gives a check with the rook on e8. The king is forced to lose the right to castle, king f1, and we reach the most brilliant move of 13-year-old Robert Fischer. He plays bishop e6, attacking the white light-squared bishop and sacrificing his queen on b6. Bobby's queen on b6 is under attack, as is the knight on c3. Whatever white does here, his position will be lost in any case. For example, if white takes the bishop on e6, then a forced mate to white follows, queen b5 check. Now there is no way to block. White is forced to run with the king to g1, because if he goes to e1, then it would be mate in 1, queen e2, since the knight controls this square, together with the queen, cutting off the king. Knight e2 check. The king is forced to return to f1, and knight g3, a double check to the white king from the knight and the queen. It is impossible to take the knight. If the king goes again to e1, then queen e2 mate, and if king g1, then comes a beautiful smothered mate. Black sacrifices his queen on f1. This queen cannot be taken by the king, as it is protected by the knight. White has to take with the rook, and then knight e2. That's how the black pieces would wall in the white king. The black knight would deliver the final checkmate. Therefore, in this position, it is impossible to take the bishop on e6. Well, what if white captures the knight on c3? Yes, that would actually be the best option here for white in this position. Then, of course, black would take on c5 with the queen, taking advantage of the fact that after the recapture, bishop takes on c3 would follow, and this position could arise, still winning for black. He would have one extra pawn, the advantage of two bishops even after exchanges. Take, bring the second rook, and control the vital e-file. The rook would enter e2, eat all the remaining white pawns on the queenside, and win. So this line would also not help white save his pieces. Therefore, Donald Byrne chooses the third option, not the most obvious one. Here, white does not lose immediately, so he captures on b6 with the bishop. He accepts the queen sacrifice, but then follows bishop takes on c4 with check. The king is forced to retreat to g1. The black knight and bishop begin their deadly windmill. Knight e2 check, capture on d4, again a discovered check, the king must step aside. King f1, again knight e2 check, and now knight c3, a discovered check to the white king. The king retreats once more, and finally black takes the white bishop on b6. The white queen is under attack, the rook joins the attack along the file, and the queen moves forward, also attacking the black bishop. The rook rises by elevator, activating itself and defending the bishop on c4. The rook on a4 is in turn protected by the knight on c3. The black pieces begin insane activity. The white queen takes the pawn on b6, and black finally captures the rook on d1. For the sacrificed queen, Robert Fischer gets a rook and two bishops in this position. White urgently opens a luft for his king, planning to hide him on h2 and bring his last inactive piece, the rook from h1, into play. White has big problems with piece count, so it is very desirable for him to connect the rook to the game. Fischer captures the pawn on a2, brings his rook into the second rank, and the pawn on f2 starts to hang. The white king hides on h2, the rook is opened, attacking the knight on d1. The knight takes on f2, counterattacking the rook, and rook e1, white offers to exchange rooks. Fischer takes the rook, and after the intermediate check on d8 with the queen, he blocks with his bishop on f8. White captures the rook on e1. We now get the following position. Fischer still has a rook and two bishops for the white queen. The white king is facing a deadly mating attack. Too many black pieces are in play. So Robert Fischer plays bishop d5, aiming at the weak point in white's camp, the pawn on g2. White returns his knight into the game, blocking the bishop's action, and Fischer centralizes his knight to e4. White attacks the black pawn on b7, b5, simply defending it. And in this position follows h4. White tries at least to open the shell of king on the king side. h5. Fischer with an iron hand gives white no chance. Now knight e5 begins to threaten knight d7. White gets some activity here. It is important not to blunder knight d7, as then the bishop on f8 would be lost, and Fischer could even get mated. But simply king g7, now knight d7 would be a blunder, since the black bishop is no longer pinned to the king, standing on g7, and bishop d6 would follow, skewering the white king and queen on b8. Therefore, first king g1. White removes the king from this dark square diagonal d6 h2, and now we are welcomed by the climax of the game of the century, bishop c5 check. The white king begins his final journey, king f1, a step forward into darkness. The black rook completely cuts off the white king along the second rank, knight g3 check. The king has only one square to retreat to, e1. Bishop b4. The bishop joins in from the right flank. Again, the only retreat, king d1. Bishop b3 check. At the end of this thorny path, there is no light for the white king. King c1, knight e2 check. The only retreat, king b1. And knight c3, the finishing blow to the white king. King c1, and a beautiful checkmate with the rook on c2, completely cutting off the white king. Thus, the young, promising chess player Robert Fischer truly made a statement about himself after this game. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this game. If you would like to support what I do, I've left a link to my Patreon in the description where you can watch exclusive content. Thank you for watching. See you soon.